Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're cracking open Swedish Mentality by Åke Daun. It's a fascinating look at what makes Swedes, well, Swedish.
Yeah, it's a really interesting exploration of the cultural and psychological factors that shape how Swedish people think and act.
I'm excited to get into it. I've always found Swedish culture intriguing, maybe a little mysterious even. Like, are Swedes really as reserved as they seem? I once spent a week in Stockholm and, well, let's just say making small talk felt like a contact sport.
That's funny. Well, Dawn actually addresses this perception of Swedes being reserved, especially compared to, some other cultures that are maybe a bit more outwardly
Right,
expressive.
right. But he makes an interesting point. He argues that it's not so much about a lack of emotion. It's more about, how can I put it? A cultural preference for emotional control. And maybe a bit of understatement.
So it's not that they're not feeling things, they're just not like broadcasting it on a loudspeaker.
Exactly. Think of it this way. In some cultures, it's totally normal to greet someone with a hug and a kiss on the cheek, maybe even two kisses.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to do that in Sweden, I'm guessing.
Uh-huh, probably not. In Sweden, that kind of greeting might come across as a bit much.
It makes sense. Okay, so what about this whole thing with Swedes being brutally honest? Is that just a stereotype or is there some truth to it?
Don talks about this too. He suggests that this Swedish honesty, it kind of stems from a deep-rooted cultural emphasis on directness and transparency. It's not necessarily about being blunt, but more about valuing, clear communication and getting straight to the point.
So no sugarcoating to spare someone's feelings.
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's more nuanced. Swedes do value being considerate, but they also believe in being, upfront and authentic. It's about finding that balance, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Right, right. So it's a bit of a tightrope walk, trying to be both honest and tactful at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it's something that can be really tricky to navigate, especially in cross-cultural interactions where those expectations around communication styles might be very different.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about another stereotype, the Swedish love of solitude. Are Swedes really at their happiest when they're like alone in a forest somewhere?
Well, there's definitely a grain of truth to that, I'd say.
Yeah.
Don talks about how Swedes have a strong sense of independence and self-reliance. He links this back to their history, navigating those harsh landscapes and long winters. They often had to rely on themselves and their families to survive.
It's fascinating how those historical factors can still have such a strong influence on a culture, even centuries later.
It really is. And, it's not just the past. Don also points out that modern Swedish society, with its emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, it reinforces this sense of autonomy.
So they might enjoy their alone time, but they're not necessarily hermits, right?
Exactly. It's more about, like, finding that balance again, the balance between independence and community, which is something that Don explores in a lot of detail.
I see. So we're starting to see a pattern here, aren't we? These stereotypes about Swedish culture, they might have some basis in reality, but it's always more complex than it appears on the surface.
Absolutely. It's a tapestry of cultural influences, historical experiences, evolving social norms. That's what makes exploring a culture like this so fascinating, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So we've talked about Swedes being independent, valuing their personal space, but that makes me wonder about like their social interactions. How do you navigate those unspoken rules of Swedish social etiquette?
Yeah, it's definitely something you become more aware of when you're interacting with people from different cultures, those unspoken rules.
Right, like I've heard stories about awkward encounters with a gift giving in Sweden.
Ah, yes. Gift-giving etiquette. That can be a minefield in any culture, can't it?
Definitely. And don't even get me started on trying to understand the whole concept of lagom.
Lagom. Ah, yes. The enigmatic Swedish word that seems to encompass a whole philosophy of life.
It does, doesn't it? Like, I've tried to wrap my head around it, but it's one of those things that's so hard to translate.
It really is. I mean, you could say just the right amount or moderation, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be more about a feeling, a sense of balance.
Exactly. Lagom is all about balance and harmony. It's about not standing out too much, not being too extreme, and just striving for this sense of equilibrium in everything you do.
So how does that actually play out in everyday life?
Well, you see it everywhere in Swedish culture. From their design aesthetics, think minimalist furniture, functional clothing, to their social interactions.
Right, so it's like lagom extends to their emotional expression as well, like we were talking about earlier.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about expressing yourself, but not overwhelming others with your emotions. And speaking of social dynamics, We can't forget about Jantelagen,
Jantelagen. Okay, there's another one of those Swedish words I've heard about.
another tricky one to translate. But it's a cultural concept that's really important for understanding Swedish mentality.
So what does it mean, essentially?
At its core, Jantelagen is the idea that you shouldn't think you're better than anyone else, and you shouldn't try to stand out from the crowd.
Interesting. So it's kind of like a cultural code that encourages humility?
Exactly. It's about emphasizing the importance of humility and also conformity. Not boasting about your achievements, not trying to draw attention to yourself.
Wow, that's quite a contrast to some other cultures where, individual achievement and self-promotion are highly valued.
It is, isn't it? It's one of those fascinating cultural differences that can sometimes lead to misunderstandings.
I can see how that would be. So where does this idea of Jantelagen come from?
Well, Dawn suggests that it's rooted in Sweden's history as a more collectivist society. For centuries, cooperation and social cohesion were essential for survival, especially in those rural communities.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it was really important for everyone to work together for the common good, and individual ambition could be seen as a threat to that balance.
So Jantelagen was a way of like maintaining social harmony.
Exactly. Now, of course, in modern Swedish society, things are a bit more complex. Some people see Jantelagen as outdated, maybe even stifling, while others still consider it an important part of their cultural identity. It's a bit of a debate, actually.
Right. It's like walking a tightrope between staying true to your cultural roots and adapting to a changing world. But I'm curious about how these concepts, lagom and Jantelagen, how do they actually play out in everyday Swedish life? Like, can you give me some concrete examples?
Sure, let's take the example of workplace culture. In a lot of Western countries, it's common to have a very hierarchical structure in the workplace, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Where the boss is clearly in charge and employees are expected to defer to their authority. But in Sweden, you often see a much flatter hierarchy.
Oh, interesting.
Decisions are often made collaboratively, and it's not uncommon for employees to, challenge their superiors or offer their opinions freely.
That's really interesting. So even in a professional setting, that emphasis on equality and consensus really shines through.
Exactly. And this actually ties back to what we were discussing earlier about Swedish honesty, right?
Right.
While they value direct communication, they also believe in creating a respectful and inclusive environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts and ideas.
It's like they've found a way to be both honest and harmonious at the same time, which is...
It's a delicate balance,
It is a delicate balance.
but it's one that seems to be deeply ingrained in the fabric of Swedish society.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a feel for how lagom and Jantelagen influence how Swedes interact with each other. But what about, like, closer relationships? How do Swedes express emotions in those more intimate settings? Is it still all about understated affection?
That's a great question. It's easy to think Swedes are all about keeping their emotions in check, but of course, they're just as capable of deep feelings as anyone else.
Right, of course.
Don actually talks about this. He says that while grand gestures and really effusive displays of emotion, those might not be the norm in Swedish culture, Swedes definitely do express affection, just maybe in subtler ways.
Like what? What would be an example of that?
We'll think about acts of service rather than, grand pronouncements. Don found that in Swedish families, for instance, showing love often means doing things for one another, offering practical help, being present and supportive, that kind of thing.
So less about saying I love you, more about quietly making sure the dishwasher's loaded.
Yeah, basically, it's about those small, everyday gestures that really reinforce a sense of closeness and connection. And it's not to say that Swedes are incapable of expressing affection verbally, but it might be, well, more understated compared to what you'd see in some other cultures.
Right, right. Okay, but what about those bigger emotions, though, like grief or anger or even, intense joy? Are those expressed differently in Swedish culture as well?
That's a really interesting question. And it gets to the heart of some pretty significant cultural differences. Dawn points out that Swedish society, in many ways, kind of encourages emotional control, particularly in public settings.
So if you're feeling overwhelmed with sadness or anger, the instinct isn't necessarily to, like, have a public meltdown.
Exactly. Now, it's important to remember that this is a generalization, and every individual, regardless of their culture, will express themselves in their own way.
Of course, of course.
But generally speaking, Dawn's research seems to suggest that Swedes might be more likely to, process those strong emotions privately, maybe seek support from close friends or family members, rather than displaying those emotions openly to the world.
So it's more about finding a trusted friend to, like, quietly process those big emotions with.
Yeah, something like that. And this whole cultural norm of emotional control, it can sometimes lead to misunderstandings, especially in cross-cultural relationships. Someone from a more outwardly expressive culture might mistake that Swedish reserve for coldness or disinterest, when in reality there's often a lot going on beneath the surface.
It's a good reminder that we should never assume we know what someone else is thinking or feeling just based on their outward behavior.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about those initial stereotypes of Swedish culture. We dug into those fascinating concepts like lagom and Jantelagen, and we even explored the subtle ways Swedes tend to navigate their emotions. As we wrap up our deep dive here, what would you say is Dawn's overall takeaway message about Swedish mentality?
Well, if I had to sum it up, I think the key takeaway is that while Swedish culture definitely has its own unique quirks and customs, ultimately it's about balance. Finding that sweet spot, between individual freedom and social responsibility,
Yeah.
between honesty and consideration, between being authentic in your emotions and maintaining that sense of social harmony.
Balance. Just like lagom.
Exactly. Lagom isn't just a word in Sweden, it's a whole way of life. And I think, while it might seem a bit elusive to those of us outside of that culture, understanding that concept, that striving for balance, it can really help us to appreciate Swedish culture and the people who live it on a much deeper level.
I think that's a great note to end on. A huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this fascinating deep dive into Swedish mentality. For our listeners, as you go about your day encountering new people and new perspectives, maybe keep Talon's words in mind. Embrace the complexity, challenge those assumptions, and hey, maybe you'll even find a little bit of that Swedish lagom in your own life. Until next time, happy diving.